Introduction: What is creativity? On a cold February night in New York City in 2012, I exited a midtown bar with a friend, having just taken in a typical Broadway mega musical. Before we had the chance to get our bearings, an unkempt man dressed in an ill-fitting bomber jacket and a New York Yankees beanie confronted us. My initial reaction was, I'm ashamed to say, one repeated countless times in cities all over the world when tourists encounter the homeless. An attempt to dodge the situation as quickly as possible. However, before I could formulate an excuse, he broke into song. He had the most exquisite voice. He would not have sounded out of place in the show I had watched that night, having been perhaps a bit more inebriated than I would like to have been. I can't recall the exact words, but it started with the line, "Don't be bashful, don't be shy, divided by don't be afraid of this homeless guy." The lyrics included a request for money. He was only a few dollars short of the price of a Broadway musical course in which he was going to be top of the class. I forget the rest of the song, primarily because I was too busy laughing and fumbling in my pockets for change. Could my money help him turn his life around and enter the magical and creative world of Broadway? Would his name soon be inscribed in neon above the bustling Manhattan streets? I walked away from the encounter elated. Here was a guy down on his luck, sleeping rough in the streets, but possessing a talent for song, comedy, and salesmanship. He had taken the situation he found himself in and capitalized on it artistically. He was engaging in music, dance, and comedy, aping the stereotypical New York City street performer so ubiquitous in countless rags to riches stories. A homeless person becomes a street performer, becomes a Broadway extra, becomes the star, becomes rich and famous. Proof that anyone can make it. He was being very creative, wasn't he? The more I thought about it, though, the answer I hit on was no. Talented? Absolutely. Creative? No. To my eternal regret, I didn't ask about his life, but his story can't have been unique. Back in 2012, there were approximately 45,000 homeless people in New York City. Point 2. He was living in a global city that has developed under a regime of capitalism in which severe social injustices are inbuilt. Because of these injustices, people often have to beg, perform, or rob people for money just to survive. This man clearly had a gift, and he was using it in a way that many others with similar talent use it. He was selling it. This man, who found himself without a home at the hands of a rampant, unjust and gentrifying urban market, was doing what he thought he must do in order to survive. He was using the talents he had just to scrape by, so he could perform the following day, and every other day, over and over again. 3. Today, the system that causes homelessness and the other related injustices, precariousness, racism, and the emboldening of fascism, massive inequality, global health epidemics, and the rest, is the very same system that tells us we must be creative to progress. This is because capitalism of the 21st century, turbocharged by neoliberalism, has redefined creativity to feed its own growth. Being creative in today's society has only one meaning: to carry on producing the status quo. The continual growth of capitalism has become the prevailing order of life. It has not always been this way. Creativity has been, and still is, a force for change in the world. It is a collective energy that has the potential to tackle capitalism's injustices rather than augment them. Creativity can be used to produce more social justice in the world, but it must be rescued from its current incarceration as purely an engine for economic growth. This book will expose how creativity is wielded for profit. It will outline the ways in which people and institutions are being told to be creative in order to proliferate more of the same. But it will also highlight the people and processes that are against this kind of creativity, in that they forge entirely new ways of societal organization. They are mobilizing it in a different way. They are enacting a creativity that experiments with new ways of living, ways that conjure entirely new experiences that simply would not exist under capitalism. A history of creativity. Creativity has always been a slippery and nebulous concept, but strip away the millennia of etymological layering, and you are left with a kernel of truth. It is the power to create something from nothing, and it is a power rather than an ability. Being creative is more than the ability to create something from nothing in response to a particular need or lack, nor is it simply an ability to produce a new product that the market has deemed necessary. Creativity is a power because it blends knowledge, agency, and importantly desire to create something that does not yet exist. Far from being reactive, it is proactive. It drives society into new worlds of living. So rather than what is creativity, the more pertinent questions become who or what has that power and desire, and what is the something that is being created. In ancient societies, this power was always a divine power, a God that made the heavens and the earth. From traditional Judeo-Christian views of the all-powerful Creator God and the story of Genesis, to Ptah, the Egyptian demiurge who brought the world into being by simply thinking it, the act of pure creation has been beyond human agency. Mere mortals were imperfect, sinful beings, subservient to an Almighty who had ultimate and unlimited powers to build something out of nothing. But since the Enlightenment, Western civilization began to dominate, colonize, and exploit the resources of our planet. Religions that preached the denial of the self and subservience to an external other creative power were incompatible with a need for a better, richer way of life. So people began to look inward for sources of creativity, according to the doctrine of the dominant faith of the Western world, Christianity. We were made in the image of God, and so we too had the power to create, hence to separate ourselves from the rest of God's creation. We imbued ourselves with the power to create. During the Enlightenment, thinkers such as Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau saw that human imagination and creativity was the path to progress. Not a blind genuflection to an all-powerful God, science was the way forward, not faith. As Nietzsche proclaimed, God was dead, and we had killed him as a result. It was craftspeople, philosophers, and scientists who were considered creative. Those who labored for a lifetime to hone their intellect and their skills were bringing into being new ideas and tools that allowed us to progress as a civilization. 6. Humanity, not God, was creating something from nothing. What's more, artistic creativity and a broader appreciation of culture were marbled through everyday life. They were part of the commons. Music, poetry, and art were not considered to emanate from creative genius or a higher cultural plane, but were simply part of collective social life. Shakespeare, in his day, would not have been thought a genius at all. He would have been seen as a craftsman, a wordsmith whose work was to be appreciated, enjoyed, and consumed collectively. 7. Although creativity was increasingly thought of as an individualistic trait, there were alternative schools of thought. Groups such as the Diggers and the Levellers in England in the mid-17th century vaunted the commons as more important to human progress than self-interest. The intricate cooperation among a group tackling the complexities of sharing and maintaining land was considered very creative. It was a collaborative and collective creativity that encouraged equality between people. Cultural production and artistic endeavor were integral factors in the process of maintaining a just society. But it was a mode of societal organization that, even at the time, was under increasing pressure from a dominant mode of thinking that focused on self-interest, the hoarding of private wealth, and a reliance on interpersonal competition to provide equality. As European powers began to plunder more of the world, they became richer and richer. Fueled by a growing capitalist way of life that encouraged self-interest over cooperation, the wealthy merchants wanted to privatize the enjoyment they got from the artistic culture they had experienced collectively. The greed and selfishness around which Western societies were increasingly being organized bred a new desire to hoard land and, crucially, cultural products. So the wealthy began to commission great works of art, and the more impressive these were, the more status they granted the commissioner. In combination with a phase of romanticized individualism, we saw the privatization of creativity. The artist producing the work became increasingly important, a development that, over time, wrenched artistic production out of the collective social arena, individualized the creative process, and gave birth to the modern conception of the creative genius. The onset of the Industrial Revolution further entrenched the divide between those who were able to consume art and those who were not. The wealthy had more time and resources to consume culture, while the workers spent more time on the factory floors. With the onset of the printing press, and later photographic and cinematic technology, cultural production itself became industrialized. Adorno and Horkheimer, in their now seminal text The Culture Industry, argued that capitalism had enabled this mass production of culture. It had entrenched a divide between a popular culture that numbed the masses into passivity, and a high culture that heightened the senses. 8. This separation of cultural consumption into popular and high art characterized much of the 20th century's articulation of creativity. Artists produced art worthy of the name. The rest was industrialized forms of mass objects that had far more to do with machine-like production than it did creative genius. Schonberg and Picasso were creative. The Hollywood studios were not. 9. So creativity, or more accurately the power to create something from nothing, had gone from being a divine power to a socialized and collective endeavor, to an individual characteristic that could be traded. Being creative now had value. It was a character trait that was much sought after by employers, businesses, and governments. It was an exchange value to be exploited, and this is where the UK government plays an important role in the contemporary etymology of creativity. In 1997, Tony Blair swept into power. Much of the Labour government's early success lay in embracing the concept of Cool Britannia, an exaltation of the UK's pop culture and artists, in a reversal of the divide that Adorno and Horkheimer viewed as indicative of capitalism's culture industry. Blair's New Labour Party celebrated popular culture and the creativity at its core. By doing this, New Labour caused two major structural shifts in the socio-economics of culture and creativity. It related to the people on a national level, and moved the economy from post-industrial services to the proliferation of knowledge-based work. The former of these structural shifts got New Labour the votes, while the latter allowed it to advance a rhetoric of creativity as having an economic value and to forge a brand new growth agenda based on knowledge, entrepreneurship, and innovation. In 1998, it created the Department for Culture, Media and Sport and set about formulating a remit for the creative industries from the remnants of an unfavorable and out-of-date cultural industry policy 10 using templates forged in Silicon Valley and Hollywood, where the profitability of intellectual property had been perfected. This new UK government set about adopting a cultural production policy that championed its competitiveness, global reach and viability for UK plc. It was a phenomenal economic success. The creative industries began to be championed as the UK's flagship sector. In 2016, they were estimated to be worth £84.1 billion to the UK economy and employed around 2 million people. Not even the global financial crisis of 2008 curtailed their growth. As this success became celebrated, countries all over the world began to replicate the rhetoric and use the language of creativity in their economic and political narratives. So much so that today creativity is applied to more and more aspects of our lives. Now, everyone is encouraged to be creative, at work, in our personal lives, in our political activities, in the neighborhoods in which we live, in schools, in our leisure time, in the choices we make in what we eat every night, and how we design our CVs. We are bombarded by messages that by being creative, we will live better, more efficient and more enjoyable lives. From line managers, corporate CEOs, urban designers, teachers, politicians, mayors, advertisers, and even our friends and family. The message is be creative and all will work out for the better. They eulogize that we now live in creative times and we are encouraged by thought leaders to free ourselves from the shackles of bureaucracy, centralized power and social straitjackets, and unleash the inner creative entrepreneur. In doing so, we will create innovative products and services that will empower us in work and social life. Moreover, we are told that this version of creativity is no longer the privilege of an elite genius few. It is something that everyone has. Creativity can be found in unskilled amateurs, on the street, on the shop floor, or in the waiting room. We are all invited to take part in this new democratic and liberating form of creativity, and in so doing, we will create new products and processes that will transform social and economic life. Contemporary society is formulated, operated and maintained with creativity as the core source of progress. This is having a huge impact on everything around us, from the places where we work to the ways we are managed. The traditional corporate hierarchy is now a defunct system that negates creative activity. Governments are too bureaucratic and stifle innovative policy thinking. Regulation is the enemy of flexible, agile and creative work. Social services, charities and other third sector institutions are failing not because their funding has been drastically cut, but because they are not creative enough. Hospitals, schools and universities that fail do so because they are insufficiently entrepreneurial and can't adapt to a rapidly changing marketplace and digital technologies. With the onset of this language, institutionalized into terms such as the creative industries, the creative economy, and the creative class, creativity became the critical paradigm of economic growth. The spread of this economized and capitalism-friendly version of creativity has been turbocharged by the infusion of neoliberal ideologies, formulated in the intellectual cauldron of the Chicago School of the 1940s and 52nds. Neoliberalism has become one of the most prevalent ideological forces of our time. Various readings of neoliberalism have seen it viewed as a mixture of free market economic thought, the elevation of self-interest as the guiding force of progress, minimal state intervention, and, increasingly, invasive forms of biopolitical control. 12 at its core, though, neoliberalism is about the marketization of everything, the imprinting of economic rationalities into the deepest recesses of everyday life. The political theorist Wendy Brown has argued that neoliberalism configures human beings exhaustively as market actors. 13 Every decision we take then becomes an act of weighing up the costs and benefits of choosing one option over another. If I hug my child now, will it help her become a more confident and employable adult? If I go for a run now, will it mean I'm able to be more productive later? Swipe left or right for love. If I spend more time counseling this student, will it increase my student feedback scores? Seen as a means of societal organization, neoliberalism was openly adopted by key world leaders in the 72nds and 82nds, notably Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US. One of their key tropes was the importance of the enterprising self. It wasn't up to the government or society to help you out. If you wanted to succeed in this world, you had to unleash the inner entrepreneur. It is easy to see then how neoliberalism and the creativity rhetoric go hand in glove. Being creative today means seeing the world around you as a resource to fuel your inner entrepreneur. Creativity is a distinctly neoliberal trait because it feeds the notion that the world and everything in it can be monetized. The language of creativity has been subsumed by capitalism. Capitalism's creativity. The dominant narrative of creativity is one of creating more of the same. Contemporary capitalism has commandeered creativity to ensure its own growth and maintain the centralization and monetization of what it generates. Marx prophetically argued that capitalism does not see its limits as limits at all, only as barriers to be overcome. Its relentless pursuit of resources to exploit and wealth to generate for the elite means that the only creativity capitalism has is in destroying alternatives and turning them into fertile and stable ground for further growth. 14. The social theorists Luc Boltanski and Yves Chiapello, in their work The New Spirit of Capitalism, have argued that in the world after the protests in Paris in 1968, capitalism's growth has become predatory. 15. It preys on the people, ideas, things, and movements that are in direct opposition to it by mobilizing the creative industries of advertising, branding, and public relations. Contemporary capitalism actively seeks out those who are opposed to it and offers fame and fortune. In essence, capitalism stabilizes those movements, people, and ideas that are outside it by naming them. It brings them into the mainstream and the broader public consciousness. It does all this to prep them for commercialization. Many countercultural movements, from hippie culture to punk to skateboarding, have fallen foul of capitalism's lure of monetary reward. In the 21st century, this process of co-option has become intensely rapid, and in some cases, extremely crass. Take for example the furore over an advert for Pepsi that aired briefly in early 2017. The advert is focused on a laughably generic protest march, whose participants carry placards with slogans such as "Join the conversation" and "Love." The fashion model is taking part in a photo shoot nearby, and spies an identikit male counterpart in the rally who seductively beckons her to join in. She throws off the shackles of her manicured beauty by discarding a blonde wig and smudging her perfectly applied lipstick, and joins the throngs of the protest. She then grabs a Pepsi can of her own from an ice bucket and hands it to a policeman who is standing guard alongside the rally. He sips the refreshing soda, nods approvingly to the fashion model and to his fellow law enforcers. Everyone cheers and hugs each other, and the screen fades to black. Live bolder, live louder, live for now. Drink Pepsi. 16. The advert rapidly received opprobrium on social and mainstream media platforms. 17. At a time of intense anger in the U.S., with marches against Donald Trump's presidency and institutional racism in the police, this advert was a blatant co-option of protest aesthetics to hawk a sugary soda drink, with a less than subtle riff on the famous image of Ishia Evans being handcuffed by police officers in riot gear at Baton Rouge in 2016. Pepsi sanitized protest and redirected the powerful imagery of urban-based activism away from the social injustices they are trying to correct, to selling more drinks. Deaths in police custody, and the oppression of protesters by police who used kettling, pepper spray, and wrongful arrests were raw in the public imagination. And when Pepsi aped the protest look for gain, the rebuttal was rightfully swift, and their retraction welcome. But the very presence of such a branding exercise is symptomatic of how capitalism mobilizes its agitators as vehicles for its proliferation, drawing on an advertising and technology industry that scours the social world for images, movements, and experiences yet to be commercialized. Capitalism's creative edge leeches any possibility that these could be utilized to create alternative social worlds. Any movement that is looking to destabilize capitalism is viewed as a potential market to exploit. Hence, capitalism's creative power does not create, it appropriates. It offers stability to dissenting voices via financial incentives, recognition, or even the promise of arrest from the emotional and physical exhaustion of constant resistive practices. But in so doing, those anti-capitalisms cease their destabilizing practices. They become fertile grounds that can be harvested for more profit. Indeed, this is how capitalism's appropriative mechanisms have been so successful. It is the creativity rhetoric fueled by the ideology of self-interest, market logics, and competition that has been wielded as capitalism's most potent weapon. It has become the very means by which capitalism can boast, "There is no alternative." Against creativity, the following chapters highlight the ways capitalism co-opts creativity for its own growth. Through the prisms of work, people, politics, technology, and the city, we will focus our attention on how everyday life is being saturated by a creativity rhetoric that actively discourages us to work creatively and move towards a horizon of impossibility beyond the appropriative capitalism of the contemporary world. This book is in opposition to the way in which we are told to be creative. It is against creativity, but in highlighting the injustices of this articulation of creativity, I wish to show how there can be an alternative, perhaps revolutionary creativity, one that is about creating new phenomena to which capitalism is unaware. It is increasingly difficult to see, but there is a powerful force in the margins of society and in the fissures of the commercialized world that are destabilizing the ground on which capitalism's future is being harvested. Creativity should be about seeking out those activities, people, things and ephemera that resist co-option, appropriation and stabilization by capitalism. More than that, it should be about amplifying them. It is this version of creativity that this book looks to champion. One work, Relentless Creativity. Later in 2012, after my trip to New York, I visited the Media City UK site in Salford, near Manchester in the northwest of England. I was interviewing management personnel at the newly opened BBC studios about their relocation from London. After the interview, I was given a tour of the facilities, some of which were still being constructed and finished off. I was shown the state-of-the-art television studios and radio suites, and went behind the scenes at the BBC Sports and CBeebies departments, which had yet to be fully opened. As I was led around the building, what struck me was the vast open-plan offices and the lack of private workspaces. There were breakout areas with large, circular and colorful seating, and an abundance of screens, some rolling the BBC News channel, some blank. I couldn't be sure, as it was obscured, but I'm almost certain I also saw a foosball table. It was very reminiscent of the style of workspace that has become synonymous with US-based tech companies, particularly Google. I put this to my chaperone. I asked whether or not this layout was a departure from the previous workspace in London, and what the rationale was for configuring it like this. The answer was one I did not expect. He said that creative industry workers are a lot like male peacocks during the mating season. If they're not constantly showing off, they're not going to get anywhere in this business. So by getting them to work in the same space, where they can see each other's work, they are more inclined to produce better, more creative results. At the time, I laughed appropriately and carried on taking in the surroundings and everything else my chaperone had to tell me about the intoxicating surroundings of this highly creative place. But looking back, this passing analogy was far more appropriate than perhaps he thought. For me, it represents almost perfectly how creative work is conceptualized in business and government parlance. First, it highlights the individualization of creative labor practices, despite the rhetoric that it champions collaborative working. Second, these open-plan spaces that supposedly encourage the collision of ideas and people actually negate the need for a physical office or workspace at all. Third, it shows that to succeed in the creative economy, you need to be flexible, adaptable and dynamic, and whether or not you're in the office, you always need to be at work. But these three themes have come to dominate creative work. How is creativity thought of and implemented in the worlds of business and policy? What it means to be creative at work is to produce only more growth of contemporary forms of capitalist production. At the same time, other forms of creative work in economies that produce radically alternative, or indeed anti-capitalist, means of socially organized labor are being marginalized, destroyed or reconfigured for profitable gain. The result is an increase in the precariousness of work, the destruction of home life, and the slow erosion of socialized labor models, or what Marx called communal production. Work has always been creative, but centuries of capitalist appropriation have leached the use value of all forms of labor into concretized means of wealth generation. Artists, musicians, coders, writers, bloggers, sculptors, crafters, designers, architects, scientists, and other members of the creative class are currently being creative only insofar as they are producing new ways for capitalism to appropriate the world. What I will explore, however, is the idea that with some radical new practices, they could be used to revolutionize it. We are all creative, right? To shed light on creative work, how it came to be conceptualized and mobilized, and how it is destroying socialized forms of labor in creative production, we need only look at the work of one man. The best-selling book The Rise of the Creative Class, written by the urbanist Richard Florida, was published in 2002 and radically changed the notion of creativity in business and political realms. Florida's argument was simple: everyone is creative. The new economic order, he argued, is fueled by this creativity, but only a few people are able to use it for economic gain. So for a place of business to succeed, it needs to attract those who are able to make money from that creativity, those he called the creative class. These were the talented and innovative individuals who were going to change the world for the better, one paycheck at a time. They were people who defied the stuffy, overly bureaucratic nature of normal work life and preferred flexible working hours and dressing down for the office. Perhaps they even spent a day or two a week working in a coffee shop. They craved autonomy and a less stifling management structure, and didn't always require financial incentives. Gone were the days of the organizational man that characterized workplace culture from the post-war period. As William White's famous text argued, to get ahead in corporate America, people needed to engage in the old-fashioned Protestant work ethic, be hard-working, diligent, thrifty, and obedient to higher powers. But in addition, he argued that only through collaboration does work become worthwhile. People need to sublimate themselves to the group, which goes on to produce bigger and better results. more than would be capable by working individually too. The creative class shunned all this. Collaboration was important, yes, but only as a means to further individual aims and career goals. Making up about a third of the workforce, Florida's creative class are often highly educated and are able to use their talent to generate economic possibilities for their companies, institutions, or locality. 3. They are nonconformists, introverts, maybe even a little dorky, but they are able to generate different ways of thinking, new products and services to bring to the market. People in creative class occupations, he argued, will earn nearly twice as much and are remarkably resilient to economic recessions. Estimates are that in the U.S., while service sector job losses after the financial crash of 2008 clocked in at 6.2 million, creative class job losses barely registered. This is because creative workers are flexible and can adapt their work to changing macroeconomic conditions. The creative class can also be more egalitarian than the working, service, or agricultural classes. According to Florida, the creative class is 52% female. However, it is 80% white, more than the national U.S. average of 74%. So while everyone is creative, only a select few benefit from this economically. This dichotomy dominates his thesis, but as many scholars have pointed out since his work was published, Florida is simply recasting the Marxist class division that created the systemic inequalities and injustices of capitalism in the first place. 5. Throughout his oeuvre, Florida argues for a particular type of creative work that is the apotheosis of economic growth and social progress. This is not limited to particular sectors, although he is at pains to prioritize creative industries as core, but is more about the kind of work people do, wherever they happen to be. Creative work is good because it encourages growth, and all other work is not because it is boring and ultimately unfulfilling. It allows and indeed champions mobility of labor, rather than being stuck in monotony. The creative class that Florida lays out with a curiously narrow set of empirical data is always measured against the non-creative working class and the service class. 6. Naturally, it is the former that is shown to be the most important, diverse, resilient, and dynamic sector of the economic labor force. Also, throughout his discussion of the creative class, not only are their economic virtues championed, but their consumption and living standards are nearly always painted as an inspiration for the rest of society. In one of his more famous anecdotes from his own life, he states, "The person who cuts my hair is a very creative stylist much in demand, and drives a new BMW. The woman who cleans my house is a gem. I trust her not only to clean but to rearrange and suggest ideas for redecorating. She takes on these things in an entrepreneurial manner. Her husband drives a Porsche 7. Hence, as we are all inherently creative, if we can exploit that creativity even in service jobs, we will enjoy elite consumption patterns." The creatification of all jobs is thus the key factor in social mobility and economic growth. In other words, working class people can enjoy the benefits of the middle class if they just creatify their work. After all, we are all creative, we just need to unleash that creativity on the world. It is no surprise then that national, regional, and local governments, business leaders, charity managers, and even rock stars fell over themselves to extol the virtues of the creative class. They acknowledged that it was the lifeblood of the knowledge economy. Florida's work had a robust veneer of statistical justification with endless graphs and tables. It used rags to riches stories that captured the imagination. It appealed to a cosmopolitan elite by confirming their social and class biases. Crucially, to this day, the book is used to justify continued inward investment and gentrification. As long as it looks creative, Florida has provided a magic recipe for economic success, in which creativity is the fundamental ingredient. In the intervening 2 decades, a lot has happened in the U.S. that has seen this thesis unravel. The financial crash, the subsequent sharpening of income inequality, gentrification, and the accompanying social cleansing of inner cities. Not to mention the rise of the populist anti-cosmopolitanism, racism, and fascism all the way to the White House. In his most recent work in 2017, The New Urban Crisis, Florida admits that much of the aspirational success of the creative class, and its perceived bohemian utopia, has not come to fruition. He freely admits, "I found myself confronting the dark side of the urban revival I had once championed and celebrated. A dark side, though, has always been there. The very inequalities that existed in cities that the creative class thesis was supposed to address were the very same inequalities that the thesis exacerbated. It had just recast those same divisions along lines of whether or not we are creative." While stopping short of a full admission of complicity, he says that he was startled and disturbed to find that the influx of creative class professionals into an area caused house prices to rise precipitously, which rendered it unaffordable to all but an elite few. 9. He goes on to say that the rise of President Trump and other populist leaders such as Rob Ford, the right-wing mayor of Toronto from 2010-14, has set back progressive urban movements by decades, a rise that came about, in part, because of the glorification of a style of consumption unattainable to all but the very few. So despite Florida's recent backtracking and his insistence that the acute inequality of the creative class thesis in action is a residual factor rather than a structural quality, the creativity rhetoric he boldly proclaimed is the new normal of development across the world. In one striking example, Florida was invited to participate in a video call to a remote part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, on a former plantation, to a group of workers who were trying to set up an art center on the old site. Florida set out his thesis of the creative class and how it can ignite a new mode of working. He was questioned about how his formula could work in the DRC, and without a hint of irony, he said, "In the DRC isn't the wealthiest place on the planet. In a place that has struggled, you can place a new model, of course, predicated on his creative class theory 10. So even the DRC, a country ravaged by centuries of imperialism, whose natural resources are mined for the raw materials to make consumer products for the West, can be creative if only it follows the right model." According to Florida and those who subscribe to and implement his worldview, creative workers are an essential part of any business, charity, government, public institution, or even family. Scan any job description and creative will be one of the key required attributes. A quick search through any jobs listings will show an advert for a nurse that asks, "Could you be the highly motivated, creative, and effective registered nurse we are looking for?" 11. Or you'll come across an advert for a research assistant on a project on mental health at a leading UK university looking for someone with the ability to engage creatively and productively with mental health service users. 12. In many sectors, including those not formerly viewed as creative industries, creativity has become a vital attribute. There are even construction companies that look for innovative self-employed builders. 13. And the fast food outlet Subway is always on the lookout for sandwich artists. 14. Socialized care, research rigor, the ability to lay bricks and making a sandwich are recast as creative activities. So, whether you are a nurse, a researcher, a builder, a sandwich maker, or, yes, a fully qualified member of the creative class, you are required to be innovative, entrepreneurial, and creative at work, rather than freeing us from the shackles of monotonous, non-creative labor. It has become clear that the rhetoric of creative work is merely a ruse that allows work-like practices to invade our leisure, social and non-economic lives. Creatifying jobs, it turns out, does not lift menial non-creative work into the utopia of creative non-work. It brings to bear on all work the dogmatic and unjust nature of capitalism's interpretation of creativity. Florida was right about one thing: we are all creative, but not in the way he thinks. We are all creative because that is what all labor is now recast as. Individualization. In the early years of creative industry policy formulation, much was made of collaborative working. Creative firms shunned the linear and hierarchical form of governance, and sang the praises of a flattened structure. Computer game companies in particular were analyzed intensively and shown to have extremely innovative and progressive organizational models. Instead of management meetings, committees, and subcommittees, they held daily agile or scrum meetings or huddles, in which all workers came together to brainstorm activities, iron out potential issues, and bounce ideas off each other. In 2001, 17 U.S. software development companies met in Snowbird, Utah, to form the Agile Alliance. They wrote a manifesto that championed the advantages of this way of working across the creative industries. 15. This more informal mode of intercorporation communication was seized upon by other sectors and replicated in private and public institutions alike. The perceived benefits were that it brought together more diverse, often conflicting opinions and experiences, and led to better problem-solving and ultimately more innovative and creative goods and services. The mantra of collaborative creativity became almost assumed, and it is now a given in any creative industrial policy. 16. Yet the collaborative nature of creative work that the policy documents and business managers are so keen to encourage does little to engender any true sociality or communal work beyond a surface-level veneer of collective individualization. It promotes collective work but rewards individual endeavors. Indeed, some studies have found that this agile form of firm organization is regularly undermined by senior management and remains ineffectual against traditional structural forms of firm decision-making. 17. Look at some of the world's creative industry success stories. Apple's success is supposedly built upon the genius of Steve Jobs, not the army of Chinese workers in Foxconn, the children mining the raw materials in the DRC, or the innovation in glass toughness technology by Gorilla Glass. 18. Facebook's rise to global domination of social media is portrayed as the result of the determination of one man, Mark Zuckerberg, but he has been accused of stealing the idea while at college 19 and without tax-funded government grants worth up to $5 billion. Elon Musk's Tesla empire would not exist. 20 These examples cut to the heart of an inherent contradiction to the narrative of creative work. It often extols collaborative, agile, collective and cooperative working practices, but only rewards insular, atomized, self-interested and individualized work, and the physical office and workspaces have adapted to this. Like Media City UK and Salford, the boundaries of individualized work are eroding, replaced with an environment that attempts to catalyze collaboration and networking. But, as my chaperone so eloquently outlined, this actually serves to ramp up our individualism by forcing us to perform this collaborative work, rather than actually engage in it. Walk around any creative city neighborhood, and you'll find these kinds of spaces throughout the streetscape. For example, Shoreditch, the beating heart of London's capitalistic creativity, has spaces called the Ministry of Startups, TechSpace, the Cube, the Brew and many others. Having worked in a few myself, I know they are modeled on a creative aesthetic straight out of the Floridian playbook. Long tables, breakout spaces, a cafe, repurposed industrial paraphernalia adorning the walls, play areas, arcade machines. They are specifically designed to create an environment that appeals to the 30-something creative class, almost like a second home. It's an intoxicating vision of just how free work can be. And this individualization masked as collectivism explains the rise of co-working spaces as the model working environment. They take the open plan office idea out of the firm and make it available to all. Today, cities are awash with adverts for creative co-working spaces. They appeal because they hide the increasing individualization of work under a veneer of collectivity, with a seasoning of hipster kitsch subculture. These kinds of spaces and the work they espouse are seen as critical by many urban and business leaders because they allow for the collision of different people, ideas and experiences. These spaces are eroding the barriers between work, rest and play. Indeed, from the perspective of employers, they are vital in reducing barriers to connectivity and collaboration, collapsing the boundaries between the office, the home, the street, the cafe, and even the bed becomes a means of further profit generation. The traditional notion of the office becomes almost redundant. Why have an office if employees can work from home? Why should an employer pay for an extra hour's work when the worker will answer those emails on the way home? In fact, why should they pay a direct salary with all those costly in-work benefits? Why don't they pay for the work on a contractual or outsourced basis? Indeed, why don't they just offer exposure and reputational capital instead of actual money? Under the pressures of the creative work mantra, it is already incredibly difficult to distinguish between work, rest and play. 21 Indeed, the notion of work is being replaced by a more nebulous notion of creativity. Our entire productive selves and the relationships we keep are now geared toward producing things, ideas, experiences and services that capitalism can exploit. As the architectural theorist Douglas Spencer has argued, the old question of whether one lives to work or works to live is rendered seemingly redundant in the merging of the one into the other. This is accomplished through the practice of skills, habits and techniques required of both work and non-work within an overall schema of productivity. 22 This overall schema is capitalism's narrative of creativity, and its raw materials can be found anywhere in daily life. You have as much chance of coming up with a new idea while you're praying, playing with your child or dreaming as you do while you're at work. This individualization, and the accompanying invasion into everyday life, is the fundamental shift in how labor is conceptualized in contemporary capitalism. Florida's mantra has given an excuse to companies that strip away layers of securitization and in-work benefits, to do so for the sake of allowing more creativity to flourish. It champions flexibility, agility and dynamism over institutionalization, social formations, hierarchy and structure. In essence, it increases the precariousness of workers. Precariousness. Freelance workers live extremely precarious lives. One freelance comedian and writer I know will often have to work gigs at the other end of the country on a day's notice. They will perform to near empty rooms because they want to keep the company that's paying them on side. Their office is a coffee shop in a sports center, or at least it was until the sports center brought in paid parking. They have even had to cut a holiday short so as to do work for local radio. One month they may be able to pay the mortgage and feed their children, while another may see the overdraft increase. They have done work only to not be paid because it wasn't funny enough. Multibillion-dollar companies have told them that there aren't the funds to pay the going rate, but it'll be good for the CV. The life of a comic has rarely come with a full-time salary. But this story is not unique to this profession at all. Indeed, it is becoming more frequent in more and more sectors. Many freelancers across the economy, artists, photographers, graphic designers, plumbers, locum doctors, cleaners and so on, go through the daily routine of scouring for work, pitching, living on a highly variable income and battling corporate behemoths just to get paid. They may love the job, but also it is often the only way they can get compensated for what they do. Such is the pervasiveness of this unstructured, agile, flexible, and footloose creative work. According to the narrative, though, such flexibility is an important and unique working characteristic of the creative class. As Florida notes, the flexible schedule is partly a response to the realities of our lives today. In households with 2 working parents, for instance, someone might have to bail out early to see the children home from school, but it is also tied to the very nature of creative work. A lot of creative work is project work, and projects tend to run in cycles, with periods of crunch time followed by slower periods. Creative work requires enormous concentration. It also requires periods of downtime, even during the day. Many people tell me they like to work hard through lunch hour, then take a long run or bicycle ride in the afternoon to recharge themselves for the remaining part of their workday, which might extend well into the evening, amounting to almost a second workday. Also, creative thinking is hard to turn on and off at will. It is an odd sort of activity. One often finds oneself percolating an idea, or hammering away desperately in search of a solution to a problem, only to see the answer clicking into place at unusual times. 23. The ability to flow between work, a bike ride, work, and then play characterizes the creative worker. Companies, public institutions, charities, and governments often reduce the stability of work expressly to promote creativity. This has been taken to an extreme level with the creation of contractual and employment arrangements that glorify the precarious nature of creative and, increasingly, other forms of work. There are people on 0-hour contracts, long-term employers having their work outsourced to freelancers and self-employed associates via agencies, and the increasing casualization of labor via temporary, short-term staffing. In attempting to capture the benefits of this kind of creative work, employers are doing away with costly labor support structures and repackaging the new streamlined contractual arrangement as flexible,